Awaken the dusty legions from their slumber once more. Today we're talking Necrons and Arks of Omen and how they fit in with Warhammer 40k's new rules. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Necrons. We're going to be going through each of the armies in the Arks of Omen rules and talking about how they're going to be applying to each and every faction. The Necrons, I'd argue, weren't in a too bad place before this, kind of a bit weird though as a Warhammer 40k faction. Generally their units and datasheets weren't particularly strong, but they just had ridiculously strong objectives, being able to get all army obsec, plus some very easy secondaries, which meant that they often had a bit of a downhill mission to play. The opponents are forced to come to them, otherwise they're going to lose the game, putting them in a big advantage. Things do seem to have had a bit of a shake-up though, so let's talk through the rules and how they might impact Necrons, both in terms of the core rules of the new update, plus their points and their new secondary objectives. So first up, the new Arks of Omen detachment is shaking up things quite a bit in terms of army construction. I felt like with the points that we had before, the main advantage of it was going to be that you could just ditch troops entirely. You didn't need to take small units like Immortals or Warriors to fill detachments. Now Warriors have got a fair bit better though, that might no longer be such a big deal. I feel like they're a pretty reasonable inclusion in an army list now, due to them going down in points. It probably does mean that people won't be quite as keen to pick up Immortals and things, maybe using other units to do their job for them. The new detachment has some impacts on how you can take Catan in a list. Rather than taking one per detachment, you can now take two if you spend 1 CP, so technically the tax on that is just a little bit easier than if you are running multiple patrols. So if you did want, say, a Nightbringer and a Void Dragon in play, then it's not that hard to do that. It does mean though that you can't ever run 3 Catan, as you won't be able to have 3 detachments, so it is going to be 2 of them max, and you can't do Catan overload anymore. The detachment slots in Arks of Omen are a little bit more freeing, meaning that you can really spam a lot of one detachment if you want to. I feel like maybe the fast attack might be one of the most interesting for Necrons, to be honest. They've got the Wraiths there, plus the new and cheaper Tomb Blades, both of which are really quite effective, plus cheap Scarabs for throwing onto objectives and things. I think that the Lord of War changes might be more helpful for Necrons than most as well. The Silent King and Monoliths won't be fighting for slots anymore, so you can just pop them in a Lord of War slot within your own detachments. In particular, I feel like Monoliths are pretty big winners for that. Previously, when they were generally fielded in super heavy auxiliary detachments, you wouldn't be getting things like dynastic codes, which can be pretty handy for their survivability and damage. If you took Nihilak now, then you could be taking objective secured Monoliths, which seems at least pretty threatening on paper, plus their core and they went down in points. I think that they're going to be quite interesting. Otherwise, for rules changes, Armour of Contempt going will be pretty handy for Necrons, as they're a faction that didn't have it. In particular though, Necrons do have a fair amount of AP-1 and AP-2 weapons that didn't get on well against Armour of Contempt. Perhaps some of the most obvious picks are the Flayed One's Blades that were AP-1. Mass volume of those attacks is going to be so much more effective against Marines now, and same for things like Gauss Flayers. Particularly the banks of them on the Ghost Arks and the Doomsday Arks are a lot more threatening against the entire field now, a barrage of AP-1 shots. In terms of the balanced data slate changes, there was only one fairly big change for Necrons. This was the nerf to Eternal Conquerors, which means that you can't take that custom dynastic tradition alongside a circumstance of awakening. Basically, if you want the whole army obsec, then you can't pick anything else. Realistically, this just means that the Eternal Conquerors one is just never ever going to be taken. It's basically flatly inferior to the Nihilak dynasty now. Nihilak also has the whole army obsec besides Catan and things, plus they get a bit of a durability boost when they're in your own deployment zone, a stratagem for shooting while doing actions, which is always handy, and they also get both parts of the Eternal Guardian protocol, a pretty handy durability boost all game long if you'd like it. Of course, Eternal Conquerors being nerfed and not being able to be taken alongside the pre-game move thing will be a bit of a tone down to Necron objective scoring in general. People were running it in big numbers for a reason, it was very good at scoring points, but realistically I feel like Nihilak isn't an enormous way behind that, and it might mean there's just a little bit more diversity in terms of dynasties being fielded on the board, maybe Novrok and Methrid getting a bit more of a look in. In general, I'd say they're perhaps some of the most important changes. A few other things though are that the fly changes means that Doom Scythes and Night Scythes are both just quite a lot worse. You can't start them on the board and have them gaining line of sight on things turn 1, and the Night Scythe can only get so close for that prismatic dimensional breach stratagem. On the other hand though, free strategic reserves is pretty handy for a few things in Necrons. Anything that you wanted to start off the board and keep hidden for a turn but you might have struggled to hide behind terrain. It's also pretty helpful for that dimensional breach stratagem for things jumping out of monoliths potentially. If you had a couple of those on the board and you were having a unit delivered out of that, it could deliver some seriously heavy combat troops straight into melee. It could be okay for a couple of small disruptive units as well. throwing things to score objectives around different parts of the board, or maybe even going for a gamey charge with some long-range Novok charges to get a +1 to charge, so with a reroll that could be semi-reliable. Overall, for the core rules changes, I think it's broadly good news for the Necrons. The main bad thing is that Eternal Conqueror's Dynasty nerf. Moving on to the points changes though, and it's exclusively good news here. Games Workshop do seem to have been taking the idea to heart that they can make the general power of Necron units stronger provided they rein in the objectives, and quite a lot of datasheets have gone down in points, at least a reasonable amount, some of them some fairly important datasheets to the army. First up, and a much requested datasheet to get an improvement, were Warriors. They've gone down from 13 points to 11, a big 16% drop, and this really does make them solidly more efficient. If it hadn't happened, I felt like Necron lists would just be running no Warriors whatsoever and just focusing on other slots, but now it has, I feel like, going back to the old tactics of big blocks with reanimation orbs, and maybe supported by things like Reanimators, Chronomancers, the Veil of Darkness, and blasting away with some Gauss Reapers. I think they will be taking quite a lot, particularly in armies that don't have the army-wide objective secured. Novok will get on well with them. If you wanted them getting to the midfield as well, their ride on the Ghost Ark has gone down in cost. That's 115 points now, so a decent 12% drop there. That thing's just all around a strong transport now. Those Gauss Flare arrays will be pretty savage now Armour of Contempt isn't ruining their damage output. They resurrect warriors and are quite tough as well. I feel like both warriors on foot and in the Arks will be pretty viable. Death Marks have got another decent buff as well. These elite sniper Necrons are down to 13 points. They were 15 before, so that's a 13% buff. Admittedly though, this is to a unit that just weren't taken very much previously, as their guns just aren't really all that efficient. Their damage output is still going to be pretty mediocre against enemy infantry. They're not too bad survivability for the cost now they're down to 13 and their toughness 5. I guess in theory they could be a little bit more interesting in intercepting any reserves as well, now that strategic reserves are free and they might be used a bit more. I still feel like they're probably not going to be super auto-include or anything, but including a unit or two really doesn't seem like the worst idea. They might be quite good objective campers, particularly if you've got army-wide OBSEC. Moving on, the Triarch Stalker's gone down to 110 points base. I don't really think that that's quite good enough to make it a good unit though, it just wasn't very good before. Much more exciting are the Tomb Blades going down to 18 points from 20, a 10% points cut, and seeing as I think that they were already really quite effective, this really is very nice indeed. I think that you could use these either as small objective snatching units with OBSEC and Nihilak perhaps. They can do that Awaken Machineries action if you need it, and they're not at all bad as damage dealers in their own right either. Zooming around with one of a choice of a few effective guns, you can take them in big enough units that it's pretty efficient to use My Will Be Done on them. Big winners here, I'd expect to see more of them in lists. Next up we've got the Triarch Praetorians. These guys are 20 points now, down 2 from 22, a 9% cut, and a pretty decent boost to an already usable unit. I'd say that these guys still remain in the same place that they were before, a pretty solid choice if you've got the Silent King in attendance, maybe just a touch more niche if you haven't. Between these, the Tomb Blades, Wraiths and Scarabs, the fast attack slot does look like it's going to have some competition. Moving on, we've got some heavier vehicles. The Doomsday Ark drops 15, down 9% from 160. Again, I feel like this thing's got a very solid boost. It does certainly have its downsides, being pretty swingy in the damage output, and also the damage getting kind of terrible if it moves, but I feel like it's getting towards the points cost where you can sock up those disadvantages and still have a pretty cheap and threatening unit on the board, particularly one that's kind of annoying to remove with the quantum shielding. Again, this guy will certainly like Armour of Contempt going away with all those Gauss flares. I really don't know why Games Workshop gave this thing such a big buff, but didn't do anything for the poor Doomstalker. The Doomstalker doesn't even have core, it's only 15 points cheaper than this, and it's just got so many disadvantages between less speed, worse ballistic skill, less Gauss flares, less wounds and toughness. I feel like the two are even more badly balanced than they were before now. Otherwise, the Monolith and the Lords of War have all got a 10% points cut. The Obelisk and the Vault are down to 270 points and 360. But really I think that the Monolith is the biggest winner out of these. It's gone down 30 points to 270, and it also looks like the Death Rays are free as well. They were 5 points before, now they're not. Games Workshop seem to keep on taking points off the Monolith, and now I think it's probably arrived at the point where it's actually fairly decent for the points. You do get a solid amount of wounds with toughness 8 and a 2+ save, and then you've got your main gun plus potentially 4 Death Rays worth of D3+3 damage, and some actually surprisingly decent melee threat with that Portal of Exile. I feel like a Necron list could maybe use a Monolith or two as a bit of a distraction Carnifex type unit, move it up the board and force the enemy to have to soak a lot of firepower into it, otherwise it is probably going to break some things and get in the way. They're quite a big unit that can make some fairly efficient use of core buffs as well, like my will be done, and I do think that the idea of objective secured with them in Nihilak is pretty interesting. I would rank the Monolith higher than the Obelisk and the Tesseract Vault still. I feel like it's the best of the three. Otherwise, we've got the Convergence of Dominion going down from 100 points to 80. This thing still basically has no point though now. The command protocols are board wide, so spreading them doesn't help anymore, and Necrons don't really need the extra leadership. Finally, in the Forge World section, it looks like the Canoptic Acanthrites have dropped down to 35 points per model. The Tomb Sentinels dropped down to 100. Both of those decently more usable than they were before, though I'd probably still rate the Codex options higher than them. I feel like the Tomb Sentinel is maybe the more interesting of the two, perhaps. It does get a fairly decent gun, but it is one of the units that's a monster, not a vehicle, so doesn't get core, and has less access to buffs than most. Overall, it's a very solid raft of points decreases for the Necrons. I feel like some of the best winners out of this are the Necron Warriors and the Ghost Ark, the Tomb Blades with their fast zippy jet bikes, the Monolith with its free death rays, and the Triarch Praetorians down to 20. Moving on, we've got the revised version of the Necron secondary objectives. All of these have been nerfed basically, and one is gone. To be honest, with Necrons being quite so good at scoring 100-point games in tournaments and things, I'm not really too surprised they've been reined in quite a bit. I do think that these might have a bit of a knock-on effect as well from the nerf of the Eternal Guardians and Relentlessly Expansionist combo. It was quite easy when you had pre-game moving objective security units to do Ancient Machineries and Treasures of Aeons. Now it's just going to be a tiny bit harder, though at least in Nihilak it's still going to be pretty achievable with fast-moving units. First up, Ancient Machineries is the 4 victory point midfield objective actions one. It completes at the end of your turn if you obsec, and now you can do it with core bikes and infantry, Canoptech units, but you can't do it with core vehicles. To be honest, I don't really think that's the biggest nerf in the world. In general, you wouldn't want to be doing it with vehicles. If you're taking them, they'd want to be fighting with the enemy. You can do this with cheap and potentially objective secured Scarabs, Wraiths and Tomb Blades, so it's basically fine. Treasures of Aeons as well I still rate as pretty strong. This is the one where your opponent nominates 3 objectives in the midfield. You've got to try and throw your units onto them each turn and take them off the opponent. If you can get on one of them, then you get 2 victory points, 2 for 3, and 3 for 4 now, where previously if you had all 3 it would have been 5. A small nerf there, though I think for the majority of the game you'd expect your opponent to be able to deny you at least one of the midfield. In general, I still think that this is one that you're likely to score at least fairly high on, particularly with fast-moving obsec. Finally, Purge the Vermin, which was a spectacularly easy one before in Battlefield Supremacy. That one has been toned down a bit. You basically get 1 victory point at the end of each turn for eliminating enemy units from your table quarters and also your own deployment zone. This one basically gave you a whole bunch of victory points very early in the game, basically for free. Games Workshop have chosen to change that, so you can't score this on turn 1, so you're not getting all the victory points for your own quarters and the deployment zone turn 1 if your opponent didn't have the chance to move into them. There's also a nerf to the positioning of the enemy units. If you've got enemy units that are now partially within one zone and partially within another, they deny both of the zones, not just one of them. So this one has a lot more counterplay than before, particularly if the enemy parks a tough unit at an intersection between them. I still say it's usable, but I feel like it's going to be one where you think that you're going to either be killing a very significant chunk of the enemy by the end of the game, or if they're a slow-moving army that you're going to be able to keep out of one of your table quarters and deployment zone for the whole game. Looks like against some armies this could just be a pretty bad choice now, particularly ones that move fast. Finally, they had one called Code of Combat, which was the one where you had your nobles killing enemy units and things. This one was fairly doable with the Silent King plus maybe a Catacomb Command Barge to help out. This one's entirely gone now, seeing as all factions have 3 objectives. The Necrons don't get this. Definitely a nerf to the Necrons overall. This one was quite doable against plenty of armies if you had the Silent King. So again, this will be a tone down to the amount of points that Necrons can score. I think overall with these, I'd rate the Necrons as just not being quite as strong on the objectives as they were. They still are an army that can get army-wide objective secured though in the right dynasty. I feel like all of these objectives are usable, maybe the Machineries one and Treasures of Aeons being the more reliable though. So overall, I feel like the Necrons have had an interesting sort of side grade. It's kind of a little bit hard to predict exactly how strong they're going to be after this. They're definitely a lot weaker on objectives now. They're no longer God tier that's going to be just hoovering up 100 victory points every game. But I still wouldn't say that they're particularly bad, particularly if you take Nihilak, army-wide objective secured, and their secondaries are doable. Then as a bit of a counterpoint to that, they've got plenty of points decreases to balance things out, and a few of them on some very meaningful units, perhaps Tomb Blades and Warriors in particular, which I suspect to see a bit more of in competitive lists than we are now. I'd guess that in Dynasty selection, the Nihilak one with the army-wide Obsec might still be the new go-to. It does work well with the secondaries, but probably will have a fair bit more competition with Novok. I suspect Novok lists would like to take a few warriors along though to help balance out with the objective secured. Otherwise, monoliths and multiple katana are both a little bit easier to use in general. If you want to go those ways, you certainly could. And I feel like a lot of lists would be wanting to build around ancient machineries and treasures of eons. That seems like a sensible way to go on the secondary game. As always though, let me know your thoughts as to what way you think that the Necrons will be going in this new Arks of Omen world. What units are you tempted to put on the board? And do you think that there's anything important from this overview that I might have missed? Something that's going to be very common for Necrons going forward? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and I will be trying to cover the other factions in a similar sort of style for Arks of Omen. If you want to check out my Orcs review, then that's linked down in the video description. Finally, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description also. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.